The following video will concern firearms, and we will be using measurements that are customary versus accurate versus precise, and mostly dealing with smooth bore weapons where precision isn't as required, and we're going to be using European Union standards based in France, called CIP, versus American standards called SAMI, versus British standards, which aren't. So we'll continue. Most firearm barrels have two main measurements that we work with. One of them is for the cartridge size, and one of them is for the inner diameter of the barrel. The largest or base diameter of the cartridge chamber, not including the rim, is the one we're going to be using as our largest one for the cartridge. That could be significantly larger than the next one. The average or most consistent inner diameter throughout the majority of the length of the barrel, measured as millimeters for highest precision, thousandths of an inch for the second highest precision. It's a fairly big factor change here. And or hundredths of an inch, which is much more grossly called caliber, versus caliber, which refers to the cartridge name. BMG is not a caliber. Let's move on. And least accurately, the largest diameter of a lead sphere or a bullet that as a whole number fraction of pounds will still fit inside of the bore or gauge number you're using. 12 gauge, if you're not aware of it, is at smallest size and declared size 0.729 inches. But it's close enough to 0.73 inches, you could call it 73 caliber or 12 gauge. Now, the reason there's loosey-goosey on the shotguns is normally you're firing shot. So they're much, much smaller than the, at that point, minimum diameter. It's still a 12 gauge because it will fit a 12 gauge slug in it, even if it's 74 caliber. Or is it? There's some numbers here to bring up, but we'll do that in a minute. Let's move on. 1850, primers were first developed in France that were centerfire. 1898, German rifled slugs were created and being marketed by basically 1900. In 1900s, shotguns came from any diameter from about 170 caliber all the way down. Basically one gauge, which is 1.67 inches or 167 caliber on down. You can just go buy one. There's 14 to 36 gauge for small game, up to 25 yards, maybe further depending. And if you fired a single slug, you might get better or less accuracy. Accuracy not guaranteed, lots of variability, and the dimensions were loosey-goosey again. 12 to 16 gauge rounds were for deer-sized game because they were big and heavy. Remember, this is based on firing still primarily black powder, which has an upper speed limit. It seems to have. It's a big equation. You can argue about it, but until smokeless powder became more common, you really did have a kind of an upper limit. And anyway, 12 to 16 gauges would work out to 100-yard range sometimes. 6-inch groups in some cases. 4 to 10 gauge bore, whatever you want to call it, rounds were for Africa and Indian dangerous game hunting out to 50-yard range. Now, below these gauges that were really small for small, if you fired a single slug, you get a lot more range, ridiculously so. 2, 3, or 4 times the range. And smaller groups. But it's, fit for purpose. In most instances, any gun bore larger than 0.835 inch or 8 gauge, otherwise known as 83.5 caliber, were misnamed. Let's talk about the 4 gauge stamped shells that were used in guns that did not have 4 gauge barrels. 4 gauge is 1.05 inches or 105 caliber. But these were stuffed into guns that were 5 to 6 gauge, which is around 97 to 92 caliber range. They're still ridiculously big bore, but they weren't really 4 gauge. Any shotgun larger than 4 gauge was usually for profit hunting punt gun types. These were done from a boat or some other method to shoot large flocks of birds, taking out as many of them as possible not for personal use for eating them or to feed a family member or even feed your neighborhood, but for selling them to restaurants. All of this is from 1900s forward. And again, you could get any gauge you could think up. I'm going to bring up one that seems imaginary and was obviously an example of what was going on at the time. Now, at the time, we were transitioning from black powder, which is a simple formula that's a very forgiving propellant. But because it's forgiving, it doesn't allow above a certain speed. It has an upper propagation delay to it. Also, metal was lower grade at the time. Those fine old guns that were so reliable were because you were using black powder, not pushing them, and they were low-grade metal. They were usually thicker-walled because they had to be to compensate for the crap-grade metal. After going through a recycling process, which we will bring up in several occurrences here, specifically World War I and II, metal recycling became metal pseudo-refinery activity, bringing the steel quality up higher and higher from scrap metal from the old days, including melting down old Bessie to make a real gun. But anything larger than 8 gauge was usually misnamed, and anything 4 gauge or larger, actually above 4 gauge, above 105 caliber, were almost always just for punt guns. They were basically small cannon. And then black powder came in, and the low-grade barrels would blow up. Or you'd use a lower propulsion speed and get not as good a performance. Or you'd buy a new barrel, and quinkadinkly, because steel kept improving, even a fence post with had a 1-inch inner diameter became a better 4 gauge than the 4 gauge you bought or got from your grandpa. 1913, before World War I, factory loads were available for shotguns, numbering in the thousands, like 7,000 of them. 1918, U.S. law prohibited anything 8 gauge or larger, 83.5 caliber, for a shotgun for waterfowl hunters, so they wouldn't take out entire flocks and do it for market hunting. They outlawed the market hunting, but they also outlawed the accidental market hunting, which people kept trying to get away with. This is 1918. 1920, after World War I, the variety of loads drastically reduced, and I can't find a reliable listing of all of them, but the thing is, they were 1, 2, maybe 3 types of loads for each length of cartridge for each gauge. Most gauges, most chamberings, gauges, 12 gauge for instance, could have 3 lengths, let's say, available, and 3 types. A slug, birdshot, buckshot, that's about it. The reduction was caused by 1920s stuff. 1936, the Foster slug was introduced. This did as good as the Brenneke from overseas from the 1800s, but these were now making it to where you were dealing with smokeless powder guns that could fire a slug that would be ridiculously close to an elephant gun range. And they were 12 gauge most of the time. Not always, but most of the time, depending on where you were. 1941, factory dangerous game reloads were discontinued for 4 to 10 gauge. Because you had smokeless powder, you could use a smaller projectile, and it would go deeper into the skull of an elephant. Plastic shells had been introduced by 1960s, and by 1996, 1995, when Windows 95 came out, factory loads were available only up to 10 gauge in the United States and 8 gauge in the European Union, and there was only about 200 of them. These days, you could argue that there are fewer or more, depending on where you are and what you're looking for, and whether or not all the different rounds that no one buys but they know about are really factory produced and consumed. It's always the same thing. Double-aught buck, triple-aught buck, 2 types of bird shot, and slugs. There's 2 kinds of slugs. You do load and reload things for optimization at home and make even fewer rounds. You make the ones that work for you. Now, I want to bring up the standards and lack thereof. The cartridges used for shotguns are also called canister, shotgun shells, holes, hundreds of names. The bigger they are, the more likely they are to reuse naval gun cartridge names and even dimensions. But one thing I want to bring up, as I was mentioning the metal pipe thing, a lot of guns were just fence posts. Again, the bore diameter doesn't have to match. It just can't be below a certain amount. Otherwise, you can't say it's a 12 gauge. A 12 gauge has to be, oh, wait a minute, SAMI standards is Not 72.9 caliber or 0.729 inches, it's 0.725, which would make it grossly underbore for 12 gauge loads in the 1940s and dangerous. European Union, same stuff happens, only they make it to where the chambers are different dimensions. It should also be pointed out that cartridges start out being they start out being thin-walled metal, usually brass, then thick-walled paper, then back down to thin-walled plastic because they reinforce the breech of the gun. This means you can have standards for not the bore diameter changing, but the cartridge dimension changing. It's almost impossible to look them up, but they really were made that way. A very gross example of this is the 4-gauge. A 4-gauge barrel, by definition, is supposed to be a bore diameter of 1.05 inches or thereabouts. Literally the inner diameter of a modern 1-inch pipe. It's almost identical. And since as you get bigger and bigger, you can get away with using a really thin-walled cartridge. And these were mostly brass cartridges at the time, which were very thin-walled. Most of them were made to where the cartridge would just fit into either end of the barrel, and it was just a straight piece of, it was a 1-inch fence post pipe. Now, I'm going to bring up my favorite example. From 1870 approximately to 1890, you could get something called an 11 gauge. Now, to review, a 12 gauge is about 73 caliber. A 10 gauge is about 77 caliber, and an 11 gauge is supposed to be 75 caliber, and it was. Now, the base diameter, which is the reason I'm bringing this up, for a 12 gauge is around 0.81 inches or 0.8 inches. That's the biggest dimension for the cartridge, and the majority of the chamber could be just drilled that. It's a 13/16 drill bit. A 10 gauge is 0.86 inches. That's almost, but not quite. It's almost big enough you could jam the whole shell for a 12 gauge into the chamber backwards. 11 gauge you would think would be between 0.81 and 0.86 inches for the base diameter, but it's smaller than a 12 gauge. An 11 gauge by definition should have 1/11th of a pound instead of 1/12th of a pound of lead as the maximum round ball size. And the bore diameter matches it. It's literally 3/4 inch. In fact, it's almost exactly the diameter of an 1889 standardized low-grade steel 3/4 inch pipe, which was almost exactly 3/4 inch inner diameter, hence the name for it. Even though the dimensions are based on the outer diameter, they based it on the inner diameter, and it was literally 3/4 inch. Literally, you'd go out and get a 3/4 inch pipe and then bore it to fit your 11 gauge shell, which should be physically bigger than a 12 gauge. So you'd make it, let's say, 0.82 base diameter. So what shells were available from 1870 to 1890 for the base diameter? They were smaller than a 12 gauge. Let me get this straight. You made the pipe diameter bigger because it should be, but you used a smaller shell than the 12 gauge. Why? Because these were the thin-walled 12 gauge shells. They're exactly, pristine perfect, 0.02 inches smaller, almost exactly, than a 12 gauge. This is more of a 13 gauge shell jammed into an 11 gauge gun. This was sold at a premium. Some of them were sold as rifles for elephant hunting, and they used an undersized shell that was shorter. It was a 2.5 inch limited shell. You'd stuff into a big bore gun, and it would fire through dead space to shoot shot. So how did they make an 11 gauge gun? Well, remember that 4 gauge shells were stuck into 6 gauge guns and vice versa. In fact, there's a currently available gun from Russia that was a rifled barrel that did the same thing. So what were they doing here? They were selling people fence posts and charging them a massive premium to give them a shotgun shell that was proprietary, that was smaller than a 12 gauge to fire. Standards are great. Everybody's got one of their own. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting thing looked up, and that was from page 402 and 403, Chapter 11, Cartridges of the World, 8th edition from 1997. I just thought it was kind of funny that somebody sold some really expensive pseudo-elephant guns that were lower power by definition than a 12 gauge and ran through a blown open bore that would make Mossberg shockwaves seem powerful. Mossberg shockwaves are overbore, by the way. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.